I have been talking with Mark Carney for years now.
Mark is a friend of a personal friend of very long standing. He's someone who I talk to often. It's really great for our team to have Mark providing advice to the Liberal Party so that we can support Canada and Canadians.
You're running as an outsider.
I am an outsider.
I am running to be leader of the Liberal Party and the next Prime Minister of Canada.
Mark Carney and Justin Trudeau have ambitious visions, but their policy approaches couldn't be more different. Trudeau, the ever-charismatic Prime Minister, has earned a reputation for his progressive stances, particularly when it comes to climate change and foreign relations. Meanwhile, Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of Canada and now a key global figure, is no stranger to pushing the boundaries on economic and environmental policy.
This week, there's something called the Industrial Transition Accelerator, came out of COP28, chaired by Mike Bloomberg and Sultan Al Jaber, Simon Steele, and it's 20% of the world's emissions. These are the big industrial sectors, and what they're doing is organizing the end of the value chain demand for green steel, green cement, regenerative agriculture, and on. And that moves all the way up the chain, and that will help unlock some of this financing.
As we move forward, I'd like to ask you a quick favor to subscribe and like this video. It takes just a second and helps us so much. It's one thing to advocate for green policies and financial reform, but when Carney steps into the ring with controversial strategies like enforcing carbon tariffs or invoking emergency powers to freeze bank accounts, it's clear he's ready to shake things up in ways many would consider unthinkable. And to address the challenges facing Canada and its relationship with the US, Carney seems determined to wield whatever tools necessary, even if that means rattling a few cages along the way. Mark Carney's support for a carbon tariff is one of the clearest examples of how he's positioning himself as a force pushing Canada towards a greener, more economically ambitious future.
It's fundamentally important that, in my view, and my government would do this if I'm elected as Prime Minister, to take the proceeds from our counter tariffs and ensure that they go directly to those workers who are most affected by the American tariffs, the unjustified American tariffs. At the same time, what we will do is we will cut taxes for the Canadian middle class. But that is a separate measure, which is to improve the situation of all Canadians with respect to addressing the crisis of affordability.
The concept has been a topic of much discussion, particularly in the pages of the Globe and Mail, a publication that has repeatedly backed Carney's stance. The carbon tariff, if implemented, would serve as a cornerstone of Canada's broader economic policy, pushing the country to meet international climate goals while encouraging other nations to follow suit. But it is a complicated issue, particularly when balancing the interests of industries that rely heavily on carbon-intensive processes. However, Carney and his supporters argue that this tariff could be a game-changer, both environmentally and economically, and with the backing of powerful media outlets, it's clear that this policy is gaining traction. Yet, as much as Carney is pushing for environmental progress, his approach, assertive, often unyielding, has led him to dive into even more contentious territories, like the invocation of the Emergencies Act. In early February 2022, Carney's name came up again in the context of the Emergencies Act, when he joined the conversation about how to handle the Freedom Convoy protests that had taken over Ottawa. On February 7th, just a week before Prime Minister Trudeau decided to invoke the act, Carney made a public statement declaring that it was time to end the protest. His position was clear. The protests were not just an inconvenience, but a direct threat to the country's stability. Carney didn't just call for an end to the protests, though. He pushed for more drastic measures, suggesting that authorities should focus on following the money. What did that mean? For Carney, it wasn't just about disbanding the convoy, it was about freezing the bank accounts of those who had donated to the cause. In his view, this would be a decisive way to sever the financial lifeblood of the protest and send a strong message about the consequences of supporting what he considered an illegal uprising. The notion of following the money quickly became an interesting topic. While it was framed as a necessary step to uphold the law, it also raised questions about the power the government could wield over individual freedoms. The power to freeze accounts, though controversial, was framed as a tool for restoring order, a move that could easily be seen as both a legal precedent and a political statement. In many ways, this marked a significant moment in Carney's career, showcasing his willingness to take extreme measures in the name of national stability, especially when it came to curbing challenges from both domestic and international actors. Mark Carney's approach to leadership, particularly his aggressive push for policy changes, has not come without its critics.
Is Mark Carney truly an outsider, as he says he is? Before we get the answer for that, please donate, keep us on the air. Andrew Perez is a strategist, a liberal strategist. He's really smart in politics and all kinds of public policy things. He joins me right now. I put the question to you. Carney is saying he's an outsider. Then other people come along and say, well, wait a second. He's been the advisor to Trudeau for years and years. He has said this Liberal government has been pitch perfect. I agree with everything they've done for years and years. He's been on with the carbon tax. He has been, in my review, the ultimate insider.
One of the most vocal detractors has been Stephen Ledrew, the former president of the Liberal Party. Ledrew has gone so far as to call Carney a wickedly dangerous man, a comment that carries a lot of weight considering his political background. What makes Carney's actions so troubling to critics like Ledrew is the belief that Carney's vision of governance would dangerously infringe on individual freedoms. Ledrew's concerns are rooted in Carney's willingness to push for policies that could strip citizens of their rights if they don't align with his worldview. Carney's vision of governance seems to focus heavily on centralized power and pushing through sweeping reforms with little regard for opposing viewpoints. This isn't a man who wants to work within the established political structures or compromise. Instead, he's laser-focused on getting things done according to his terms. His critics argue that his willingness to endorse the Emergencies Act, freeze bank accounts, and curb freedoms for the sake of his policies shows an alarming willingness to trample on democratic principles for the sake of expediency. It's not hard to see why such a mentality could worry those who value personal liberty and are wary of the concentration of power in the hands of an unelected figure.
Let me be clear. If we were only to remove the carbon tax, we'd create two problems. First, Canada's emissions would not decrease as rapidly as before. And secondly, most Canadian households would be worse off because of the end of the rebate. Pierre Poilievre's, with his simplistic and misleading axe the tax, doesn't care about either problem. Now, that's possible because he doesn't really believe in climate change. Or it's possible he thinks that Canada, for the first time in our history, should be a free rider on a massive global problem, leaving for other countries to solve. It's certainly clear that he doesn't really understand how important that money in the rebate is to hardworking families across the country. But we get it. We care. And that's why our plan will directly solve both problems by both implementing new climate policies that are at least as effective in lowering emissions and by bringing forward new economic measures that will make Canadian families better off.
Carney is positioning himself to challenge Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the Conservative Party, for Canada's top political seat. What's even more striking is the way Carney seems to already be acting like he's in power. His public appearances, his media interviews, and his speeches all reflect a man who believes he's just biding his time before he can step into a leadership role. It's as if he's already assuming the position without yet having to fight for it, creating a sense of entitlement that doesn't sit well with many who are invested in a democratic process that requires elections to determine the winner. The situation grows even more complex when considering Carney's apparent disregard for the actual race between him and Chrystia Freeland.
I am running to be leader of the Liberal Party and the next Prime Minister of Canada. As a party, we need to recognize that today, Canadians want and need us to relentlessly focus on one thing: the economy. Canadians want good jobs, homes they can afford, and great care for their kids. They want a government that is as careful with Canada's money as Canadians are with their own. These bread and butter issues are more important today than ever because our country is facing what could well be an existential.
Former finance minister who has been seen as a potential contender for leadership. While Freeland is actively running, Carney doesn't seem to acknowledge the competition. To him, it's not a race at all. He's already won. However, for people like Freeland, this outlook appears to ignore the very real dynamics within the Liberal Party. Though Carney may be operating under the assumption that the race is between himself and Poilievre, the reality is much more complicated. All of these elements, his controversial policies, his power-driven political aspirations, and his disregard for competition, paint a portrait of a man who is unapologetically ambitious and who seems willing to go to great lengths to reshape Canada, according to his vision. The role of polls and public opinion in shaping Mark Carney's political future has been a major talking point recently. According to polls, Carney has managed to surge ahead of Pierre Poilievre, even catching up to the Conservative leader in terms of support. On paper, this may seem like a promising sign for Carney's political ambitions, but there's a fair amount of skepticism about the validity of these numbers. Critics have pointed out that the polls' scientific methods are questionable at best, casting doubt on whether Carney is as popular as these numbers suggest. After all, it's not uncommon for polls to be skewed or misinterpreted, and some argue that this specific survey might not truly reflect the wider Canadian public's views. Mark Carney, often seen as a figure with grand ambitions to shape Canada's economic future, faces many challenges in his efforts to influence the country's economic vision. His approach is complex, particularly regarding taxation and fiscal policies. Carney promises tax cuts to the middle class, a policy that naturally appeals to voters. But beneath this seemingly attractive offer, there's a hidden agenda. Carney's broader economic stance appears to involve raising taxes through other means. This includes advocating for carbon tariffs and other environmental taxes, which, while they may make sense in a broader global context, could further strain Canadians already feeling the weight of high taxes. While he may paint a picture of reducing the tax burden for the average citizen, his policies suggest a different reality, one that could end up leading to even higher costs for the people he claims to support. This contradiction between his promises and his policies adds complexity to his public image, making it hard to reconcile his rhetoric with the actual impact of his proposals. Moving forward, Canada requires a political shift, one that prioritizes the people of Canada and ensures that the nation's resources are directed toward making life better for all Canadians. What do you think? Let us know in the comments.